Want to know Vladimir Putin's biggest nightmare? It's not NATO expansion, it's not Western sanctions, it's not even Ukraine's fierce resistance on the battlefield. What really keeps Russia's strongman leader up at night is something far more fundamental, and in many ways more frightening than any tank or missile ever could be. Russia is running out of men. This might sound surprising, but it's not speculation. In November 2021, months before Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, Putin himself admitted it. When asked by reporters what kept him awake at night, he didn't talk about NATO or Ukraine. He confessed that it was Russia's demographic crisis. Putin saw the writing on the wall. Without drastic changes, his country was heading for a slow, painful slide toward irrelevance. And yet, bafflingly, Putin chose to make his biggest problem even worse. Instead of tackling Russia's population decline, he launched a war that sent hundreds of thousands of young Russian men to their deaths or out of the country entirely. Why would he do this? How could he knowingly accelerate the collapse of his own nation's future? Before we get into that, let's look at the hard numbers. Right now, Russia's birth rate has fallen to 9.4 births per 1,000 people as of 2024, according to Statista. In comparison, the United States maintains a higher birth rate of around 11 births per 1,000 people, highlighting the growing demographic gap. But Russia's challenges go beyond just a low birth rate. The Kremlin is also grappling with a mass exodus of young men and catastrophic wartime casualties, which are accelerating the population decline to unprecedented levels. Take Putin's partial mobilization in 2022. The Kremlin called up 300,000 men, but the announcement sent an estimated 700,000 fleeing the country. These weren't just farmers or laborers. Many were doctors, engineers, and scientists, the very people Russia desperately needs to sustain its economy and population. The Atlantic Council reported that Dubai alone now hosts at least 700,000 Russians. That's nearly 1 million people who might have built families, started businesses, and contributed to the future of the country. But instead, they're gone. And that's not even the worst of it. The people who fled are the lucky ones. Western intelligence estimates that Russia has suffered anywhere from 315,000 to 500,000 casualties in Ukraine, killed or gravely injured. To put that into perspective, that's the population of a city like Atlanta, Georgia, wiped out in less than 2 years. Experts have noted that Russia is losing more men in this war than in all of its other conflicts since World War II combined. But it's not just the numbers that are alarming, it's who these casualties are. The losses aren't evenly distributed. Poor, rural regions like Buryatia, Tuva, and Dagestan, areas with historically higher birth rates, are bearing the brunt of the war. Activists in Dagestan have counted more war dead in their small region than the Kremlin admits for the entire country. In some cases, young men from these regions are 10 times more likely to die in Ukraine than their counterparts in Moscow or St. Petersburg. It's a demographic carpet bombing of the last pockets of fertile regions in Russia, as the government exploits communities with few economic opportunities, luring young men into a war that does nothing for them or their families. And it gets worse. The men who are dying or fleeing are exactly the ones Russia can't afford to lose. Even before the war, Russian men had some of the shortest life expectancies in the developed world, an average of just 68 years. Lower than Libya or Bangladesh. Alcoholism, smoking, poor healthcare, and widespread rural poverty were already killing them at alarming rates. Now, the war has turbocharged that crisis like nothing else in modern Russian history. This isn't just a wartime problem. It's a crisis with deep historical roots going all the way back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, so did Russia's birth rate. The economy was in free fall, jobs vanished, and people lost faith in the future. In times like that, starting a family felt more like a gamble than a dream. By the time Putin took power in 2000, Russia's fertility rate had plunged to a dismal 1.2 children per woman, far below the 2.1 needed to keep a population stable. And in a country with high mortality rates among working-age men, the impact was devastating. Whole generations simply weren't born in the 1990s, leaving Russia with a missing demographic, men and women in their 20s and early 30s today. Those young adults aren't around to have children of their own, creating a domino effect that's hitting Russia's population hard. Putin saw this coming. In his first major address in 2000, he warned that Russia risked becoming an enfeebled nation. things didn't change. By 2006, he tried throwing money at the problem with the famous maternity capital policy, offering cash incentives for families to have more kids. For a brief moment, it seemed like it was working. Russia's fertility rate climbed to 1.8 by 2015, but the so-called baby boom wasn't built to last. Economists found that it was tied more to high oil prices than any long-term social change. When oil revenues dropped and Western sanctions hit after Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, the trend reversed itself. By 2021, fertility rate had slumped back to around 1.5, and in urban centers like St. Petersburg, it was even worse. In desperation, Putin resurrected a Soviet-era medal in 2022, rewarding women with 10 or more children with 1 million rubles, around $11,000. Here's the problem. Who can realistically afford to have 10 children in a country plagued by economic uncertainty, sanctions, and a grinding war? And even if people wanted to, how could they, when the men who would be fathers are either fleeing the country, dying on the battlefield, or constantly fearing the next mobilization? Imagine being a 25-year-old Russian thinking about starting a family. You're living in a country where you might get drafted at any moment, inflation is eating your savings, and your future looks bleak. Is it any wonder Russia's birth rate keeps hitting new lows? This isn't just about money or politics. It's about the deep uncertainty created by the Kremlin's aggressive foreign policy. The result? A multi-layered crisis. Men are dying on the front line. Men are fleeing the country, and the ones who stay behind are too uncertain about their future to start families or invest in Russia's long-term success. It's not just the birth rate that's suffering. The exodus of working-age men is starving businesses of labor. So many men have vanished, either drafted or escaped, that companies are now hiring older workers and even prison inmates to fill the gap. Reports suggest the Ministry of Defense is even trying to recruit men in their 50s and 60s to fight. It's not a recruitment strategy, that's desperation. Even if the war ended tomorrow, the damage is done. According to experts, Russia's population is on track to lose millions more people in the coming decades. The Economist predicted a population drop from 144 million to around 129 million by 2050. But that was before the war. Now, estimates are even more sobering. The United Nations projects that by 2100, Russia could shrink to just 74 million people, barely more than half of today's population. Think about that. A country spanning 11 time zones, from NATO on its western edge to the Pacific Ocean in the east, might end up with a population smaller than Germany's. And Germany's about the size of New Mexico. How do you maintain the world's largest country with its vast territory and endless borders when you're running out of people, especially young men? This question haunts Putin. For years, he tried to Russify minority regions and boost ethnic Russians' birth rates. But ironically, the regions with historically higher birth rates, places like Chechnya, Dagestan, and Tuva, are now suffering disproportionate wartime casualties. These rural areas with few economic opportunities have become recruitment hotbeds for the military, funneling their young men into a war that benefits them the least. The fallout? Entire villages have lost their sons, fueling bitterness and resentment that could spark future unrest. Meanwhile, some experts argue that Putin saw Ukraine as a quick demographic fix. With its population of 38 million, Ukraine could have been the answer to Russia's demographic decline. If Putin's original plan had worked, strolling into Kiev in 3 days and claiming the population as Russians might have boosted his numbers overnight. But that plan failed spectacularly. Ukraine fought back with ferocity, aided by Western support, and turned the war into a drawn-out disaster. Instead of a demographic bailout, Putin got a crisis that's accelerating Russia's collapse. So the real question becomes, how does this demographic implosion make Putin more dangerous? As Russia's demographic crisis deepens, it becomes more than an economic headache. It's a political and military vulnerability. Analysts suggest Putin might lash out internationally, hoping to distract from domestic decline or annex more territory to offset his losses. It's a dangerous gamble, but for a leader facing shrinking resources and rising dissent, it might feel like his only option. An aging and shrinking population isn't just an economic headache, it's a political and military vulnerability. Rivals can exploit it, and it erodes the very foundation of Putin's power. Let's not forget the brain drain. Russia spent decades cultivating a tech sector to diversify beyond oil and gas. Now, over 100,000 tech workers have fled to places like Dubai, Istanbul, and Yerevan, taking their skills and startups with them. They're building futures that don't include Moscow. So imagine being Putin, watching your best minds leave and your potential fathers come home in body bags. How do you respond? He's tried it all, boosting soldier wages, offering fast-track citizenship to Central Asian migrants, forcibly conscripting men from minority communities, and rolling out propaganda about it being every Russian's patriotic duty to have more kids. But none of it is working. Public trust is gone. Young couples are too scared to bring children into a country at war, and anyone with the means to leave is doing just that. Even in his attempts to restrict abortion in regions like Kursk reek of desperation. Local authorities frame having more kids as a patriotic duty, urging women to keep their pregnancies. But guilt-tripping families doesn't fix housing shortages, broken healthcare systems, or the crushing psychological toll of war. You can't legislate babies into existence when the future looks this bleak. Then there's the ethnic dimension to consider. The regions with higher birth rates, places like Dagestan and Chechnya, are predominantly Muslim or culturally distinct from the ethnic Russian majority. These regions are suffering disproportionate wartime casualties. Entire villages are losing their sons, fueling resentment that could boil over in a post-Putin era. Imagine leaders in these regions asking, why should we keep sending our men to die for Moscow? Why should we stay under a government that doesn't protect us or even treat us as equals? Meanwhile, Russia's historical reluctance to embrace immigration is biting it hard. Migrants from places like Tajikistan and Uzbekistan are lured in with promises of decent wages and a shot at Russian citizenship, only to have their passports confiscated and be encouraged to sign military contracts. It's a brutal paradox. The Kremlin needs these migrants to fill labor shortages, but also sees them as disposable soldiers. Word's already spreading that going to Russia might lead you straight into the trenches, a PR disaster for a country desperately needing workers. So, could Russia turn things around with real reforms, improving public health care, tackling alcoholism, creating genuine economic opportunities for young families? Maybe, but that would require rooting out corruption, decentralizing power, and redirecting military spending into social programs. Let's be honest, none of this aligns with how Putin runs his government. Even if reforms were possible, time isn't on Russia's side. Demographic recovery takes decades. Meanwhile, the labor market, army ranks, and regional stability are crumbling right now. The man shortage isn't some distant threat. It's already here, destabilizing the foundations of Putin's regime. And yet, despite all this, some believe Russia might keep doubling down, banking on short-term military victories or energy deals with countries like China and India to offset the West's economic sanctions. But here's the real question. What does success even look like when you're bleeding your next generation dry? A shrinking, aging population can't sustain a global power indefinitely. When older generations step aside, you need younger ones to take their place, working the job, fighting the wars, and propping up the nation's backbone. Without them, cracks in the system become fractures, and fractures quickly spiral into chaos. Add enough pressure, and entire regions might decide they're better off splitting from Moscow altogether. That's why some analysts predict Russia could face fragmentation in the future, especially if a political collapse at the center ever materializes. The war in Ukraine hasn't just sped this up, it's launched Russia into a demographic freefall. Men are disappearing, pulled from the workforce, the family unit, and life itself, leaving a hole no quick policy can fill. Putin's short-term fixes, like offering 1 million rubles to women who have 10 children, feel more like PR stunts than realistic solutions. What Russia truly needs is stability, an economy free of sanctions, a government that inspires trust, and a future where young people don't live in constant fear of being shipped to the front line. But how do you build that when the Kremlin's policies do the exact opposite? And here's the darker truth. Things might only get worse. Experts fear that as Putin digs in on his disastrous war, he'll turn to more drastic measures to feed his war machine. Expanding mobilization could trigger yet another wave of young men fleeing for the borders. Every draft call tightens the noose, pushing the birth rate lower and leaving the country with even fewer people to carry its weight. The demographic grave is only getting deeper. This leads us back to the core problem. Russia is running out of men. What was once a slow decline has turned into a nosedive. Fast forward 5, 10, or 15 years, and the picture grows even bleaker. Entire regions in Siberia and the Far East will be hollowed out, with no young people left to develop industry or infrastructure. Families will shrink further, leaving mothers without partners and fewer children to build the next generation. A larger chunk of the population will be elderly, sick, and reliant on a social safety net that's already fraying. And through it all, the Kremlin will insist that everything is fine, that the war is winnable, that the West is teetering on collapse. At some point, that starts sounding less like confidence and more like delusion. You can't project power on a global scale without people to fill the ranks, man the factories, or drive innovation. Nuclear weapons might scare off invaders, but they won't stop economic stagnation or a collapsing labor force. Russia might have the largest landmass on Earth, but what good is it if it's half empty, dotted with decaying towns, and run by an aging population that can't keep the lights on? And this is the cruel paradox of Putin's vision. He dreams of resurrecting a mighty Russian empire, one that commands respect and fear on the world stage. But the policies he's enacted, militarism, crackdowns on dissent, alienating his brightest minds, and waging a ruinous war, tearing his own country apart. It's a self-inflicted collapse growing worse by the day. Some in the West might see this as poetic justice, fitting consequence for Russia's aggression in Ukraine. But for millions of Russians, ordinary people who never asked for this war, it's a tragedy. They're caught in the crossfire of a failing regime, watching their country crumble from within while simply trying to live in peace, raise families, and find hope in the future. So here's the real question. Can Russia pull itself out of this demographic nosedive? Or is Putin's empire doomed to keep shrinking, literally and figuratively, until there's nothing left but a shadow of what it once was? The answer to Russia's demographic crisis might lie in a dramatic pivot, ending the war, launching real reforms, and fostering stability. But given Putin's track record, that seems like wishful thinking. Instead, the war grinds on. Mobilizations drag more men to the front, and the exodus of young, capable Russians continues unabated. The men who might have built families, driven innovation, and powered Russia's future are disappearing, some in body bags, others across borders, and none are returning anytime soon. This demographic disaster doesn't just weaken Russia, it makes Putin more dangerous in the short term. A leader watching his empire collapse demographically might lash out, seeking to distract or compensate with aggressive military moves. Could we see another war? A direct confrontation with NATO? A massive expansion of conscription or harsher crackdowns? Nothing feels off the table for a regime backed into a corner, grasping for survival. This is the paradox Putin faces. The war he thought would strengthen Russia has only sped up its decline. His gamble to annex Ukraine's population for a quick demographic fix has backfired spectacularly. Ukraine isn't under Russian control. Its people are fighting back, and Putin is left with a shrinking, hollowed-out country that can't sustain itself. And the truth is simple. You can't maintain a superpower on empty cradles and missing fathers. You can't fund pensions, staff factories, or fill barracks if your population is aging and fleeing. No amount of propaganda or quick-fix policies, whether medals for mothers of 10, forced conscriptions, or promises of fast-track citizenship, can stop the demographic decline. Sooner or later, the cracks become too wide to ignore. This isn't just a problem for Russia, it's a problem for the entire global balance of power. A shrinking, unstable Russia could fragment, destabilize regions, or become more erratic on the world stage. And that's the chilling reality. Putin's policies have turned a slow demographic decline into a full-blown meltdown. With each passing week, Russia's future becomes bleaker. Fewer young people, more military coffins, and a government that refuses to change course. Whether it's through reforms or collapse, something has to give. What do you think happens next? Will Russia finally address its demographic meltdown, or will it keep sending its men to die in a war that's already crippling the very future Putin claims he's defending? Will the country open its doors to millions of immigrants to fill the gap, effectively changing the face of Russia for generations to come? Or will the Kremlin clamp down even harder, fueling more desperation and more emigration? Let us know your thoughts on this monumental crisis that could reshape not just Russia, but the entire global balance of of power. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great Fall of Nations content.